welcome you to the Upper Room once again. Great to be with you, and we're going to start right away with a discussion question. Not much time to relax, right? And the discussion question is this. Describe a time in your life when you were in desperate need of help. All right? What was going on? How did you react? Did you get the help you needed? I just want to give you an opportunity to share that moment in your life. And I think it'll be fascinating for your group, your community, to talk through what happens when we are in desperate need of help. When I was about 10 years old, I was walking home from school, and we lived inside a development here in Montrose, and our house was the only one that had been built. They were building houses around us. Our house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, and so when I walked home, I always had to take about, one left and three rights and one left to get home, a few blocks into the development. As I was walking home one day, and knowing that my mom would be home, she was always home, she didn't work outside the home, I was walking about halfway home and an ambulance flew past me. And I thought, wow, there's not a lot of houses back here. And I began to get a little concerned. And so I actually started my career that day of being an ambulance chaser. It was a short-lived career. That's the only time I've ever done it. But it turned everywhere I was supposed to turn. And all of a sudden, before the last turn, I was thinking, if it takes this last turn, a left into the cul-de-sac, that means it's my house. That ambulance is going to my house. That means something has happened to my mom. And now my jog turned into an outright sprint. And sure enough, I took a left there at the cul-de-sac, and it was parked in front of our house. And I just remember thinking, Lord, help! God, help! I don't know what's gone wrong with my mom, but something's gone wrong. And I ran up the driveway and up the steps and into the house. And I said, Mom! And she was standing at the top of the stairs. And she said, yes, what do you need? And I said, is that ambulance for us? And she said, no, it's for someone who needed it on the house they're building next to us. And I just remember that time from the time I was young, thinking that was one of the first times I cried out for help. Help, I don't know what's about to happen. When I was about 13, my mentor, Rich Undersair, taught me how to exercise, how to lift. And he and I were lifting alone there at the high school. Nobody was around. It was in the summer. And he was bench pressing an enormous amount of weight. I don't know how much it was. And I was supposed to spot him. Well, I was pretty much a weakling at the time. And he couldn't get the bar up, and it was crushing him. And so with little breath that he had, he told me, go find some help. And I ran out of that building and into the next building looking for a janitor or anyone that would be around in the summer that could help, and I couldn't find anybody. And again, I remember crying out, God, I need your help. And as I couldn't find anybody, I returned eventually to find that he had found a way out. Somehow he had gotten out from underneath that enormous weight and that barbell. I really did believe that when I burst back into that enlarged shed, is what it was a fairly large building, and saw him walking around, before that moment I thought, he might not have survived this, and it's my fault. And then, of course, we've told you about when I was about 35 years old, and our son Caleb was 5 and had a routine surgery. And while he was recovering, a nurse, unbeknownst to us, overdosed him on morphine. And in the coming hours and day, he almost lost his life. And I'll never forget going back to the house to get some clothes because we were going to stay there with him. And I just fell to my knees and put my elbows on his bed, his little bed, and I cried out to God, help. Okay, now, that happens to us, doesn't it? And I looked at all three of those events in my life and thought, wow, each time my fear was sure death, right? I mean, I really thought that my mom was probably dying, maybe. I thought that Coach Undersair might be squashed underneath whatever amount of weight that was, and it was on me to figure that out. And then another time, I believed that our son might die. Hopefully you haven't experienced too many of those times, but there are times in life where we just cry out and we feel helpless, and it's in those moments that we cry out to God, help! Well, in the passage we're in today, you will find that Jesus offers help, and it is much needed. We'll set that up as to why his disciples, and again, by ripple effect over 2,000 years, why we need his help and the help that he offers. That word help is one of those common words in the English language, and fascinatingly, it's both a noun, a verb, and an adjective. Did you know that? Like the movie The Help, which came from a book called The Help, it talks about some people who in the South were helping. In fact, they've been hired to help in some of the wealthy people's homes. And then you have it as a verb, of course, when someone's in need and you offer assistance, that is help. The adjective, you may not realize, is used at least in golf and in sailing when they talk about a helping wind. That's an adjective. Now, it's just a fascinating word, but it plays a huge role in our lives, and it's going to play a huge role in the lives of the disciples and in our lives as well. And so we're in this series we're calling The Expression, and we find ourselves in the upper room discourse, John 13 through 17. You know by now, if you watched the last lesson, that at the end of 14, Jesus says, let's get up and go. So the upper room discourse covers their time in the upper room, but also as they left, and last lesson we talked about they probably went out the east gate of Jerusalem and out there on their way to the Garden of Gethsemane. There were most likely a lot of vineyards, and that's where he talked about him being the vine and us being the branches and his Father being the gardener. And so we covered that, and so they're probably still walking on their way when we come to John 16. Maybe they just hung out there in the vineyard for a little bit longer, but this discourse called the Upper Room Discourse is an amazingly powerful and impactful time for his disciples and for us as well. And you certainly know by now that's what spawned the idea that we are a part of this ministry called the Upper Room. It was believed that in that time before Jesus' crucifixion, he gave instructions to his disciples that were so essential for their remainder of their lives and for the remainder of our lives as well. So that's kind of where we got the Upper Room Ministry label, if you will. And so this is an incredible time. The last hours, the last minutes before he's arrested by the Jewish leaders and before he'll go through illegal trials, and then, of course, his crucifixion the next day on Friday. You just need to know, again, that we're condensing the upper room. As I mentioned, we spent something like 50 lessons on it earlier on in our ministry, and you get those videos. So we're condensing these chapters, which is, again, just excruciating for me because I just want to go verse by verse, word by word. But we're going to really kind of fly through John 16. We'll read a lot of it, but this is important. It's so important that we get this idea that Jesus now is going to give them the reason they will need help and then give them the help that they will need. Now, in order to understand the context of what Jesus is about to say, we're going to have to go back into chapter 15 because we didn't cover the end of chapter 15. I just want to read it quickly to you, and that sets the stage for what he's about to say. And so this comes after his little lesson on the vineyard. So what I'm about to read to you is in John 15, verses 18 through 25. And it's essential that we hear this to understand what comes next. And I'm just going to read it right out of God's word. So read along with me if you will. John 15, verse 18. Jesus says, "If the world hates you, remember that it hated me first. The world would love you as one of its own if you belong to it. But you are no longer part of the world. I chose you to come out of the world, so it hates you. Do you remember what I told you? A slave is not greater than the master. Since they persecuted me," and what comes next is essential that we understand what will come in chapter 16. Do you remember what I told you? A slave is not greater than the master. Since they persecuted me, naturally they will persecute you. And if they had listened to me, they would listen to you as well. They will do all this to you because of me, for they have rejected the one who sent me. They would not be guilty if I had not come and spoken to them, but now they have no excuse, for their sin is the rejection of the Son of God, of course. Anyone who hates me also hates my Father. If I hadn't done such miraculous signs among them that no one else could do, they would not be guilty. But as it is, they have seen everything I did, yet they still hate me and my Father. This fulfills what is written in the scriptures. They hated me without cause. So why is that so important? It's because the upper room setting until that moment that I just read had been all about love. You might remember that John wrote in the beginning of chapter 13 that now Jesus loved them to the extent or to the full or to the end, and then he got down and washed their feet, and all of it was about love. And now the winds of change are changing directions, and that's what we want to focus on right away here. The winds of change have gone from love to hate. Now Jesus describes the hatred of the world for him, his Father, and yes, now for his disciples as well. The hatred that Jesus describes that the world has for him and his followers has continued throughout generations and thousands of years to us today. It is estimated at this moment in time that over 100 million Christ followers are being persecuted and are suffering around the world. So what Jesus said has come true, and what he continues to say will come true as well. Here we go, John chapter 16. We'll look at verse 1, and we're going to call this the warning. He has an enormous warning for his disciples. And you might remember at the beginning of John 14, he said, "Let not your hearts be troubled." And he gave some great promises. But now he goes back to what will trouble their hearts. He says in verse 1, "I have told you these things," the things I just read to you, "so that you won't abandon your faith." His concern is that they will experience such pain and suffering and persecution that they will want to run away, to become so frightened that their only option in their minds is to walk away from their faith. That word abandon is a great word. We've talked about it before. It's the word scandalizo, and it can mean to set a trap, to be surprised by the trap, to stumble over something. It's an offense. What he's saying is a trap is being laid for you that you know not of, and my concern is that you will succumb to that trap, be so offended that you would walk away, like so many did in John chapter 6, right? When things got tough and he said some difficult things, thousands left. So again, why might they abandon their faith? Well, there's harm coming, there's pain coming, there's persecution coming, there's trouble and fear, and oh yes, change. The winds of change. We find ourselves today at the Flying M Ranch Airport. And it's kind of on the edge of Bostwick Park to the east of Montrose. John and Adele, I know you're watching this, so you know exactly where we are. But we're here because it's a real private little airstrip. I don't know how much it's used, but you can see the windsock behind me, and I don't know how active it is. The flag also will help you see that we're looking for evidence of the change of wind, because that's what's going on here. All of a sudden, for all this time they've been with Jesus, Jesus has been the one to take the heat, to take the pressure, and they've gotten used to that. And it wasn't on them, but it was on him. And now he's saying, "I'm going to leave." And now he tacks on the kicker, and that is, "And when I leave, the heat's going to get turned up on you. The enemy is going to come after you." And so what we're about to read is a warning. That's why we call this the warning part of this passage. It's a warning from Jesus about what's coming. It's a dose of reality for these guys. Let's pick it up in verse 2. "For you will be expelled from the synagogue." Now, you might remember that in chapter 12 of John, verse 42, that John said there were other leaders that actually believed in Jesus, but they would not confess Jesus. And it's because they were afraid they would be kicked out of the synagogue. And now he says the same thing to his disciples. Now, that may not mean to you and to me what it meant to them, so let me explain it. You and I would hear, you'll get kicked out of the synagogue, and we think, oh, we'll get kicked out of church, we'll just have to go down the block to another church. No, when people in the nation of Israel were evicted from the synagogue, much like the man that Jesus healed earlier in John, and he was evicted from the synagogue, that meant the end of their lives. It meant that they were no longer a part of the nation. They were no longer part of their families. They lost their jobs. Their life was over. They were considered like lepers. And so when Jesus says, they will kick you out of the synagogues, that's coming. In their minds, they're thinking, our lives are over. And so again, he said, for they will kick you out of the synagogues. He goes on, and the time's coming when those who kill you will think they are doing a holy service for God. This is a shocker. Religious people, and that's who he's talking about, people who think they're serving God in the highest way. You might remember Saul believed he was serving God in the highest fashion he could by murdering people of the way. He says these religious people think that God is pleased with this. And this has been the case for a long, long time. The most dangerous people in the world are typically religious people. Whether we're talking about Rome and their demand that everybody bow to Caesar, they were very much religious in that way and had all their gods that you needed to serve. Or we're talking about Islam, or we're talking about the Roman Catholic Church. And I'll mention more about that in a moment, but those are all examples of religious people who harm enormous amounts of other people because they won't conform to their religion. Bottom line here, and this may come as a shock to you, religious people don't know the Lord. They just don't know the Lord. And you say, well, that's a stretch. You're saying the religious people in my life, people who say, I'm very religious, they don't know God? Those are not my words. That's not my idea. As we finish verse 3, this is, Jesus says, because, why will they do this? They have never known the Father or me. They don't know me. They're religious, but they don't know me. Dare I say that Satan uses religion to absolutely blind the eyes of well-meaning people who think religion is the path to eternal life or to nirvana or whatever it may be. Now let's finish with verse 4. Yes, I'm telling you these things now so that when they happen, wow. Now this could happen. Just kind of be on the lookout. When they happen, you will remember my warning. And he goes on to say, I didn't tell you this earlier. I didn't think you could handle it. I knew I'd be with you a little longer, but now he's obviously saying goodbye to them. Question, was Jesus right? Of course he's right. Jesus is always right. Peter, James, and Andrew were crucified. Bartholomew was whipped, then crucified. James, the son of Zebedee, was beheaded. Mark was dragged through the streets of Alexandria until dead. James, the half-brother of Jesus, was stoned to death by the Sanhedrin, by the Jewish leaders. Philip was stoned to death. Stephen was stoned to death. Matthew, Simon the Zealot, Thaddeus, and Timothy were martyred. Paul had his head chopped off. Did you realize that the Universal Church, the Roman Catholic Church, between 606 AD, when the papacy began, and the mid-1800s, was responsible for the murder of 50 million Christ followers who refused to capitulate to their rules? They were the reformers, religious people who think they know God because of all that they do for him. Jesus said, they don't know me. In 1997, the New York Times printed a study that had been done that showed that in the 20th century, more followers of Jesus had been murdered, martyred, than the previous 18 centuries combined. So we know that this is not a surprise based on what Jesus said. What he says always comes true. Now, it's not just that people abandon the faith, because of persecution. They also do it because of worldly desires. We know that from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 10, where Paul writes, Demas has deserted me because he loves the things of this life. And we see that all the time. People choose the things of this world rather than the hard road, the road less traveled of following Jesus. Every once in a while, I'll give you a Babylon Bee headline, and I found one this week that's perfect for this idea that people tend to abandon their faith for following the ways of the world and what the world has to offer. Here's the headline. Megachurch pastor understands trials and tribulations of Syrian Christians as his Mercedes AMG GT 63 coupe is currently in the shop. Yeah, you begin to wonder in the West, when will we face severe persecution? Because we think something like our car breaking down is that, and it's not that. And we know that from reading the New Testament. So that's a lot of bad news that Jesus shares again with them. But here comes the good news. The good news is help is on the way. When you've cried out for help, my guess, you have experienced God stepping in and helping. Every time that I've cried out for help, God has stepped in and helped. And he does again here, and he provides a template for the kind of help he's going to provide for his disciples and for us as well. So starting in verse 5, what we find is the first sign of help is the wind. The wind. I'll show you what I mean here in just a moment. Here we go, verse 5. But now I'm going away to the one who sent me, and not one of you is asking where I'm going. Instead, you grieve because of what I've told you. It's kind of sad that they weren't catching that little hint that he's leaving and ask about it. And then he goes on and he says, but in fact, it is best for you that I go away, because if I don't, the advocate won't come. The advocate, that is that Greek word parakletos, which means one who comes alongside, one who helps. Every time that we talk about, helping others, and we think, well, that sounds like I'm a slave, which, if you remember the last lesson, we are. God calls himself the help. Okay, so it's not a demeaning term. No, when a wife is called to come alongside her husband and be the helpmate, it was the same word used of God coming alongside us and helping us. And so he says, when I leave, the Parakletos will come. If I do go away, then I'll send him to you. And when he comes, he will convict the world of its sin and of God's righteousness and of the coming judgment. The world's sin is that it refuses to believe in me. There it is again. They have rejected me, so they've sinned. The world's sin is the rejection of Jesus. That is the sin. Okay, we talk about a lot of sins, but the sin, the unforgivable sin, is the rejection of the Son of God. Now let's jump down to verse 13. When the Spirit, now this is a different word he uses. He used parakletos, and now he uses pneuma. You remember that, right? It means breath or wind. So the first help that comes along is the wind, the breath of God. When the Spirit, and by the way, this is used 385 times in the New Testament. The conversation about the Spirit throughout the New Testament is so common that you'd have to pretend it's not there to miss it. So again, he says, when the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all truth. It's important, we'll come back to that. He will not speak on his own, but will tell you what he has heard. He will tell you about the future. He'll bring me glory by telling you, that word is literally depositing in you, whatever he receives from me. All that belongs to the Father is mine. That is why I said the Spirit will tell you whatever he receives from me. There it is, the Trinity at work. I receive it from the Father. I pass it on to the Spirit. All three of us are at work in showing you, telling you, guiding you, counseling you on how to live. This last week, I was listening to a very famous talk show host on the radio. He has over 3 million people who listen to him. And what he was saying kind of concerned me. He calls himself a Christian. Okay, that's up to him to describe himself that way. But what he was saying is you all, to his whole audience, you all need to dabble in the AI. You must know what's going on with AI. You must involve your life with AI. And I thought, really? I mean, that's the most important thing, because last I checked, only the Spirit of God gives us truth. And now this supposed follower of Jesus is demanding that all his 3 million followers dabble and really get involved with AI. That's a concern. And I kind of looked into it a little deeper. And there's a guy who has written books, multiple books on AI, starting back in the 1990s actually. His name is Ray Kurzweil. It was this guy who back in the 1990s, I think 1999, who predicted that there would be self-driving cars. Have you seen some of those? We saw some in Arizona. They're freaky to see no one at the wheel and the wheel's moving by itself, driving some guy around in the back seat. And he predicted that our phones would be telling us the answers to any question we have. And people laughed at him. They mocked him. He's having the last laugh. I want to quote him, about 4 quotes from him actually I want to share with you, because you need to take this AI thing seriously. And again, in context, I'll put it back in context after I give you these quotes. Here's some things he said. When you talk to a human in 2035, you'll be talking to someone that's a combination of biological and non-biological intelligence. Get that? Meaning every person will have some non-biological intelligence that's wired into them. So what used to fit in a building, or had to fit in a building, now fits in your pocket. What fits in your pocket now will be inside a blood cell in 25 years. By 2029, computers will have emotional intelligence and be convincing as people. We're already seeing that. We are full that people are actually saying things that are being said by computers. And then this is the last one. Does God exist? He asks. Well, I would say not yet. Did you get that? Not yet, but we're building him. That's the idea. Can you say, yes, Lord Caesar? That's what these disciples would be demanded to do. Lord Caesar, I bow down to you. Or how about the Tower of Babel? Does that ring a bell? When we think that we have become God, can reach God and become like God in that way, all powerful, I'm telling you, the winds of change have changed directions if you haven't noticed. And there needs to be a warning that comes with it. And the warning here is you will need the wind. You will need the breath of God. You will need the comfort of God in the form of his Spirit. You'll need his wisdom, and you'll need all the truth that he gives, because truth is now disappearing in totality in our culture. Of course, when they tout AI, they never talk about truth, do they? They just talk about all AI knows, but it doesn't say it's true. And I believe there'll be a small amount of truth compared to all the truth we get from the Spirit of God. You might remember back in John 14:17, Jesus said, He, the Helper, the Holy Spirit, leads you into all truth. You know him because he lives with you now and will be in you. That is reiterated by Paul in 1 Corinthians 6:19. Question, do you truly believe that the God of the universe in his spirit form is inside of you? Assuming you've surrendered your life to him and let him take your life and live through you. You have the Spirit of God. Do you believe that to be true? Because if you do, you will be constantly reminded that there's a big difference between who guides and comforts and counsels you, teaches you, and the AI that's taking over this world. And so Jesus says the wind is coming. And we know that at Pentecost, a rushing wind came in and the Spirit entered those guys and many others. And what happened next was this incredible, wonderful change. And Jesus predicted that as well. To verse 16, Jesus says, in a little while you won't see me anymore, but a little while after that you will see me again. Okay? I'm going to go in the grave and then you'll see me again. Some of the disciples ask each other, what does he mean when he says in a little while you won't see me, but then you'll see me, and I'm going to the Father? What does he mean? And what does he mean by a little while? We don't understand. Verse 19, Jesus realized they wanted to ask him about it, so he said this. Are you asking yourselves what I meant when I said that? Verse 20, I tell you the truth, you will weep and mourn over what is going to happen to me. This is going to tear your guts up, what's about to happen to me. However, the world will be rejoicing and you will be grieving, but your grief will suddenly turn to wonderful joy. He's predicting resurrection Sunday, that Sunday morning that's coming in a couple days. It will be like a woman suffering the pains of labor. When her child is born, her anguish gives way to joy because she has brought a new baby into the world. So you have sorrow now, but I will see you again. Then you will rejoice, and no one can rob you of that joy. I love that picture he gives of a mother who is in such pain and suffering. But when that child appears, it's all joy, and she forgets. And Kirsty has told me, and our son and daughter-in-law just had a child last week, and joy has already returned. All the suffering and pain is gone. They don't remember it. It's just the joy that child brings. Jesus is connecting what he's about to do to that experience that mothers have. Of course, Saul's transformation from being a murderer of the followers of Jesus, to being one of them and actually becoming the most prominent of them after obeying Jesus, when Jesus finally got his attention, is a great picture of the wonderful change that takes place as a result of the help. And that's part of the help, is that he's reassuring them it's going to be tough and you're going to grieve, but I tell you what, it's all going to turn to absolute joy real quick now. Of course, Scripture talks about that in our current state, 2 Corinthians 5:17. This means that anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life is gone, a new life has begun, and all of this is a gift from God. There is this instant change where the old man dies and I have a new life. Instant change takes over. And then, when Jesus returns, when the trumpet sounds, what will happen then? What remarkable, wonderful change will take place? 1 Corinthians 15:51. Paul writes, "But let me reveal to you a wonderful secret. We will not all die, but we will all be transformed. It'll happen in a moment, in the blink of an eye, when the last trumpet is blown. For when the trumpet sounds, those who have died will be raised to live forever, and we who are living will also be transformed. Our dying bodies must be transformed into bodies that will never die." And then he ends it this way: our mortal bodies will be transformed into immortal bodies. Yes, it is a wonderful change that takes place in our lives when the wind flows into us, and the help now that we have to deal with the harsh realities of this place. And now the next thing Jesus says talks about the help of the way. In chapter 16, verse 23, we read, "At that time you won't need to ask me for anything. I tell you the truth. You will ask the Father directly." There'll be a direct path, a direct way to the Father. "And he will grant your request because you use my name. You haven't done this before. Ask using my name, and you'll receive, and you will have abundant joy." And he goes on to say, I've spoken in different kinds of language to you, but now I'm just telling you outright that you can go directly to the Father. And guess what? He doesn't mention his mother Mary as the intercessor to the Father. That's not part of the deal. We have direct access now to the Father. We have the way, the path, right to the Father, which before that time had never happened. Of course, Matthew 27, Mark 15, and Luke 23 all describe the moment Jesus died on the cross and how the veil was ripped from top to bottom, separating the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple, from the rest of the world. The Holy of Holies was where they believed God was trapped, but he wasn't trapped there. His presence would reside there. It was only very special holy people who could be in the presence of God, they thought. And yet, at the moment of his death, that comes pulled apart from top to bottom. They had to know something significant had happened. The point of the veil being ripped from top to bottom is this: all people now have the opportunity to commune with God, as was once the case with Adam and Eve. Isn't that amazing? What a help. What a help to know I can come before God and actually cry out, "Abba, Father, Daddy." When my grandkids call me Papa, it's another word for Abba, Father. When they call me Papa, there's only now 4 people in the whole world that get to call me Papa. And when they call my name, oh, don't you think my head spins and I turn around immediately and want to do whatever they want? Because it's my job to spoil them rotten. Anyway, that's the point, is that something significant, a great help in our lives as we deal with this nasty world in which we live that hates God and therefore hates us because we follow his Son. Oh, what an opportunity we have with direct access to the Father. You think I'm making that stuff up? Hebrews chapter 10, verse 19. And so, dear brothers and sisters, we can boldly enter into heaven's most holy place because of the blood of Jesus. By his death, listen to this, Jesus opened a new and life-giving way through the curtain into the most holy place. And since we have a great high priest who rules over God's house, let us go right into the presence of God with sincere hearts, fully trusting him. For our guilty consciences have been sprinkled with Christ's blood to make us clean, and our bodies have been washed with pure water. That's great stuff, right? You might remember the story of the man who had been waiting to see President Lincoln for hours and hours, and he was getting discouraged because he just couldn't get in to see him. He had his head down, but then he looked up and there was a boy standing in front of him, and the boy said, "What do you need?" And he said, "I need to get in to see the president." And the boy said, "And you can't get in?" And he said, "No, I haven't been able to get in to see him." He says, "Follow me." And then the boy leads this man through kind of a maze of tunnels and through secret passageways, and boom, they end up in the Oval Office in front of Abraham Lincoln. It was his son, Todd, who did this, and that's how it works. The Son knows the path, knows the way to get us in the presence of the Father. I experienced that when my dad was a high school principal. You know, kids couldn't just walk into my dad's office and say, "Hey, let's talk." But boy, if they were with me, I could take them right into his office, and they were amazed. I could just walk by all the secretaries and sit down in his office and have a talk. And that's what we have. That's the great help that we had. And believe me, the times I went in and sat down, talked to my dad about stuff going on in the school that was very difficult for me to deal with, he was a listening ear and he could do something about it. The final help that we see from Jesus when we face what we're about to face is what we call the one who wins the war. The one who wins the war. You know that in 2 Corinthians 10:3 we read, "We are human, but we do not wage wars, humans do. We use God's mighty weapons, not worldly weapons, to knock down the strongholds of human reasoning, to destroy false arguments. We destroy every proud obstacle that keeps people from knowing God." We are part of a cosmic conflict, an invisible war. You know that. But what you may not remember is that the war has already been won. And we pick that up in John chapter 16, verse 31, when Jesus asks, "Do you finally believe?" It is the word pisteuo. Do you finally have confidence in me? Are you relying on me? Do you trust me? That's what he asks them. And that's the question for you and for me. After all you've seen, after all I've done, after all I've told you, do you finally trust me? Have confidence in me? But the time is coming, he says. Indeed, it's here now, when you will be scattered, each one going his own way, leaving me alone. Yet I am not alone, because the Father is with me. He predicted that they'd all scatter, go different directions, and they did. "I've told you all this so that you may have peace in me. Here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows." We've talked about that. Another prophecy that's come true. We still have trials and sorrows. "But take heart, because I have overcome the world." And he ends in this chapter with what he began in chapter 14. "Let not your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. And you will have unbelievable peace." So if I don't have peace, what's going on? It's not because he doesn't give it. It may be because I'm not looking to him for help. Maybe I'm looking to AI. You think AI is going to give a lot of people peace? And so we have this assurance that he will help us no matter how tough things get. I want to go back to the phrase that Jesus spoke, "I have overcome the world." And you may be thinking, wait a minute, I don't see anybody in charge here. I mean, it's crazy chaos. There's a really interesting analogy that comes from John Mark Comer, the author. Comer puts it this way: Jesus' victory over the devil was like D-Day to World War II, the decisive battle that marked the beginning of the war's end. The devil's fate was sealed on the first Easter, as Hitler's was on June 6, 1944. But there are still many miles to cover to reach the equivalent of Berlin. In the interim, the devil is like a wounded animal, a dying dragon, more dangerous than ever. Contrary to popular artists' imaginings, the devil is not in hell, he's here on earth. If Jesus' anthem is on earth as it is in heaven, then Satan's anthem is on earth as it is in hell. I love his analogy that, you know why there's still a battle going on when Jesus has overcome the world? Because now we march to the finish line. As in World War II, there was still a battle to be fought, even though it was all but over once we stormed the beaches of Normandy. And it's all but over when Jesus stormed the gates of hell on the cross and in his resurrection. And so we look forward to the moment, and I hope it comes soon, where he comes back to finish the job, where he marches into Berlin and it's just a done deal. Satan is thrown into the pit of hell and we get to reign with him on the new earth. There is a famous talk show host and celebrity by the name of Wendy Williams, and I'm going to be honest with you, I've never seen her or listened to her talk. But I guess she's kind of famous. I think she's about 60 years old, and she's had quite a life, quite a difficult life, but her fame did not spare her from some of the things that were very difficult in her life. A few years ago, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago, she was put into a mental institution, a care center, because it had been determined, and let me back up a little bit and tell you that she did have a lot of problems with drugs and alcohol. She was on the set on her show and passed out. She had been diagnosed with something they called frontotemporal dementia and aphasia. She was given a guardian, an appointed guardian by the courts, and this guardian was to just watch over her in this facility. This last week, I mean a couple days ago, from the 5th floor of this New York assisted living facility, Wendy Williams dropped a note, and it went to the street below, to the sidewalk below, and the note was very simple. It simply said, "Help Wendy." Well, the police were given this note, and so they went up and they looked at her and found that she was really in her right mind, and so they escorted her down, and they would take her to Mount Sinai West Hospital, where she would be given a cognitive test, and she scored 10 out of 10. Is it possible? And again, her guardian swore for the last several years she is incapable of functioning. She is out of her mind. I'm guessing that guardian got paid well. Is it possible that she has actually been imprisoned this time? I don't know. I don't know her. But it sure reminded me of another story that was made into a terrible movie. You don't need to watch it. It's called Frances. It's the true story of Frances Farmer, an actress from Seattle who was very famous in the 40s and the 50s, but the same thing happened. She had some problems with drugs and alcohol, and her mom, of all people, put her into an institution. And in the end, and she swore all along that she shouldn't be institutionalized, but she was imprisoned there, abused there in every way imaginable. It is said that in the end, they gave her a lobotomy. Now, if you don't know what a lobotomy is, you got a phone that you can talk to and he'll tell you, because AI is the best. Anyway, it's a terrible story, but she always claimed she was imprisoned. These poor ladies, help. The difference between them and us, however, is that they're asking humanity for help. You and I have the help of the divine, of the sovereign God. And that's what Jesus is promising in this passage. Isn't it great? I hope you're encouraged by that. Have you noticed in our society and our culture that mental illness seems to be running rampant? I mean, you can see it in a lot of different forms. That would be an interesting discussion question. Christy and I find ourselves talking a lot about how you see mental illness issues everywhere. And these people just don't know where to turn to for help, for real help. Aren't you glad that you and I have the help of Jesus? Aren't you glad that Jesus promised and has delivered on the wind and the way and the winner of the great war? Do you need help today? I guarantee you can find it right there. The Spirit of God inside you, the direct access to the Father, and the understanding that this terrible war that goes on here has already been won. Thanks for joining us here. I don't know what's going on with our windsock or not, but the winds of change were coming in this text, and they're coming in our lives, I believe. We love you. Thanks for doing the journey with us.